On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Our focus today is on the unexpected friendship of John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Our guest, David R. Stokes, is a historian and author. He knows quite a lot about the first Kennedy-Nixon debate, which actually took place back in 1947 in a small Pennsylvania town. I'll be introducing David in just a few minutes, but before I do, there are a couple points I want to touch on briefly. First, I want to tell you that our next program is coming up very quickly. In fact, it'll be a week from today, Wednesday, November 17th at 11 o'clock. Our focus at that time will be on the program called Understanding Texas. And this is really designed to be a crash course for those of us who are clueless Easterners to the culture, history, and politics of Texas. This is a program that will include music, humor, and some storytelling. So I really hope that you'll be able to join us. A quick reminder that you can ask a question at any point during the program this morning. Just look for the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That's where you would go to type a question for David. He's happy to respond to any and all questions and will do so once he's had a chance to finish his presentation. Here are some things you should know about David. You know, we live in a time when writers specialize. They work in one, perhaps two genres. David really harkens back to an earlier literary tradition when we had writers like Norman Mailer and Ernest Hemingway, who gloriously wrote in as many genres as possible, and usually with great success. David has published 19 books. Some of them are serious histories, some are novels. He's completed 2 screenplays, including one that's been optioned by the Hollywood actor Blair Underwood, who you may remember from LA Law. More amazing to me, David has published nearly 400 opinion or op-ed pieces, and for a tremendous variety of different markets, everybody from the Washington Post to Preaching Magazine. I'm interested in the fact that David has had a thriving second career as a ghostwriter for some important and influential people. I'm dying to ask him who, but obviously he can't tell us. But we know that at this point, he's done about 50 of these projects. And you know, for many years, David wrote and delivered his own sermons when he was a senior minister at the Expectations Church, and that's in Fairfax, Virginia. David has also been a broadcaster and a content provider for Salem Media. Salem specializes in developing content for those who are seeking a conservative, Christian, and family-friendly outlook on daily news and current events. So it's now my pleasure to turn the program over to David Stokes.
Thank you, Dick, very much. Appreciate it. So right on target today, we're going to talk about John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And I think you used the term frenemies, which is an interesting term. Most of us in hindsight, and certainly people who weren't around during their lives and active careers, look at them through the prism of their political campaign in 1960, a very fierce rivalry, which it was. But what is a little known or lesser known fact these days is that the two men started out as pretty close friends. Not bosom buddies, but certainly more than mere acquaintances, even though they came from vastly different backgrounds and they represented totally different constituencies and had different political views, widely different political views. But I think there's a bit of an interest in this and a bit of a hunger among many people, certainly some of us of a certain age. He mentioned the demographic where this would be people somewhere between 50 and 80. I'm right in the middle. I'm 65, so I cut the middle there. That we look back, and maybe we do so through rose-colored glasses to an extent, and it's always possible to be selective in our memories in hindsight, to a so-called bygone era where there was a bit more civility among political partisans, even the most fierce of political partisans, and even the most powerful and dynamic debates and political processes and on issues didn't seem to cut as deeply, and we didn't have as much of the scorched earth stuff that we see today. And it's possible that we're over romanticizing the past. But I think the Kennedy-Nixon story is an actual case in point. Now, these are two young men who share vastly different backgrounds in their origin story. The John F. Kennedy story. He was born to privilege. His father was a multimillionaire by the time he was born in 1917. And by the time Jack was born in 1917, and went on to acquire a tremendous amount of wealth, exploiting economic cycles, famously getting out of the stock market just before it crashed in 1929, and then coming back in and exploiting those losses. He made what by the middle of the last century would be the equivalent of several $1 billion in today's dollars. And he made sure that his children all benefited from it. He was a tough taskmaster on his sons, particularly, and he had great ambitions for them. He had great ambitions for himself. Joseph Kennedy, honestly wanted to be the president of the United States. And when he was appointed to the ambassadorship to the court of St. James over in Great Britain, he saw that as a stepping stone, possibly to the political sphere in 1940, although I think FDR put him over there across the pond, as they say, to keep him away from that. But Kennedy was not temperamentally disposed to be an ambassador, certainly not during those troubling times of the late 30s, as what Churchill would describe as the storm clouds. The gathering storm was making its way and gathering together with what would be World War II. And Joe Kennedy famously stepped in all sorts of trouble, stepped on his feet, put his foot in his mouth, all the metaphors you can think of, and wound up being recalled, coming back to the United States. And after even endorsing FDR in 1940, was unceremoniously discharged. He didn't want to get into the war, largely for two reasons. Financial, he thought it was bad business, war was bad business, and he comes from a long line of business people in that regard, Henry Ford in the First World War notably. But he also had sons who were going to be hostage to the ambitions of warlords. Particularly his two oldest sons, Joe Kennedy Jr. and John F. Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But when the war came, these boys jumped on the boat, and Joe Kennedy became an aviator, and Jack Kennedy, he had some health problems which prohibited him from really getting into the military, but eventually strings were pulled. He went into the Navy, first in intelligence, and ultimately to become the skipper of a patrol boat, a PT boat, number 109 famously. And most people know the story. Joe Kennedy died in a heroic venture. His plane exploded up over the English Channel. Jack Kennedy, on the other hand, became a hero when his PT boat was cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. And he heroically saved his crewmen, and the story became quite legendary and helped propel the whole story of Kennedy, the narrative that eventually made him president of the United States in 1960. Now, what is lesser known is that Joe Kennedy was the golden child. He was the one with charisma. He was the one who could speak. He was going to be the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. When he died, Joe Kennedy's, all of his hopes and dreams that he had first for himself and then for his first oldest son, fell to Jack Kennedy, who reluctantly picked up the banner. And after the war, signed up to run for Congress. At first, there was some thought of running for the lieutenant governorship in Massachusetts, but he opted to run for the United States House of Representatives in 1946. He faced a tremendous long list of candidates in the Democratic primary, which was tantamount to election in that particular district in Boston. And he won it handily, became a bit of a star at the point. Now, by this time, he had already written a book based on his master's or his graduate thesis from Harvard when he graduated with his bachelor's degree, called Why England Slept, which was a play on words on a Churchill title. It became a bestseller, no doubt due to some of the investment of his own father and the promotional wizardry that he knew. And so he was already pretty well known. Now he's going to go to Congress. That's Jack Kennedy. Richard Nixon, on the other hand, was not born in privilege. He was born in an abjectly poor kind of environment. His father was a grocer, ran a filling station, famously failed as a owner of an operator of a lemon ranch in California. But Nixon also found his way to the Navy. Now, these are two men who served their country, and that's the defining moment of their generation, what we would often call now the greatest generation, and I think well appropriate. And he went into the Navy, and they actually served, Kennedy and Nixon, not far from each other. They likely had a conversation at one time or another about how they probably just missed each other in this port or that port. But they both got out of the Navy. Nixon gets out of the Navy, and he was already a graduate of Duke Law School, already had practiced some law. He tried to join the FBI, but he'd been rejected for this, and by J. Edgar Hoover and others. And so he was looking for something to do, and he received a letter from a group of powerful Republican businessmen in his district there in California. And the letter was asking him to be willing to run as a Republican candidate against the Democrat. His name was Jerry Voorhees in that particular district. He met with them, he impressed them, and he agreed to run. Now, what's interesting about this 1946 campaign is that if you read the newspaper accounts and the promotional materials as furnished by the candidates and their campaigns themselves, Kennedy portrayed himself as a conservative Democrat. Nixon portrayed himself as a liberal Republican. So the whole liberal conservative thing that we think about today was sort of turned upside down in that particular moment. Nixon, he quickly showed himself to be a tough political fighter and a savvy politician. Defeated Jerry Voorhees handily in the race, and that was a surprise to so many people. And he was elected to Congress himself. So the story of the relationship between Kennedy and Nixon begins in early January, the 3rd of January in 1947, when both men are now in Washington, and they're sworn in as members of the 80th Congress, the one that Harry Truman campaigned eventually so hard against, the do-nothing 80th Congress. And one a Republican, one a Democrat. There's an interesting picture. That very day, they met. And where they met was at the National Press Club. And at the National Press Club hosted a mixer, cocktail party, whatever, for the freshman class coming into Congress. Now, this was a class of congressmen that was largely made up of newly elected people who had had war experience. This is what has given them their edge. I don't think you could have run for dog catcher in 1946 if you weren't a veteran, hadn't seen combat or been in the military. And so they met at the National Press Club that day. And I describe the meeting in one of my books called Jack and Dick When Kennedy Met Nixon, which is a dramatized, it's a book of fiction, but it's based on fact. It's a dramatized account of, in fact, the only thing dramatized is dialogue of their meeting that day and what happened over the next few months, which I'll talk about here in this presentation. There is a picture, a photograph that was taken that day. And if you look at the photograph, you can find it online, but I don't have it with me. But if you look at the photograph, it's that freshman class of candidates crossing party lines, Democrats and Republicans. And they're in the back row, standing next to each other, are two thin, young politicians. One is Richard Nixon. He's older by a few years. And then there's John F. Kennedy. Of course, Kennedy had battled malaria. He also had the various problems with Addison's disease, which was already pronounced in his body, although not known and not acknowledged. And so he was very frail looking, but you have these two guys standing next to each other. This is back in 1947. Of course, they received their appointments as far as the committees they'd be assigned to. And both men were assigned to what was called then the Education and Labor Committee in the House of Representatives. Now, this is the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, because in 1946, for the first time since 1928, the Republicans really bested the Democrats, and they won control of the House of Representatives. So Nixon was the representative from the majority party, and Kennedy. And they were bookends on this committee. You sat at opposite ends, the very end of the spectrum whenever the committee would meet. Nixon on one end and Kennedy on the other. Nixon would later joke they were both low men on the Labor Committee. And then he said, this is when he met with Jack Parr, I think in 1962. And then Kennedy ran for president. He says, now he's up and I'm down. But they were members of the Labor Committee. So at that time, labor was a big issue in America. The nation had come out of the Great Depression. Some would say because of the New Deal thing, but in reality, it was World War II and the industrialization of things, the tremendous labor need for that in World War II. And America had achieved a certain amount of prosperity. But now in 1946, you had strikes all over the place because of the workers who had held off for so long due to obvious patriotic reasons, and let's pull together and do this thing. By that time, in various phases of the labor industry, from coal to steel to the railroads to certainly automobiles, there were labor actions. And so we had the Wagner Act, which had come in the mid-30s, which basically created a lot of rights for organization of companies and of workers. But then there was something proposed in 1946 called the Taft-Hartley Law. And basically, this was a law that sort of trimmed the edges of the Wagner Act and put the ball back in the court of the right to work kind of mindset, and limited some of the powers of organized labor, limited the ability of people, limited things that it made it had like a secret ballot, a number of things. I won't go into the whole Taft-Hartley. It was a bill that was strongly opposed. Taft was Robert Taft, of course, the senator from Ohio, Mr. Conservative, Mr. Republican. I mean, he was a contrarian in many ways. He was even against the Nuremberg trials, and that came out in Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. But they had this act, Taft and Hartley. The Hartley was the House of Representatives side of it, Fred Hartley, and the Democrats from Truman on down opposed the thing, and the Republicans, for the most part, endorsed the thing. It eventually was passed. It was vetoed by Truman, and his veto was overridden. So it was the law of the land, remains such basically to this day. Now, as it was being discussed in Congress, one of the members of Congress who represented a district in Pennsylvania, just off the other side of the state from where you all over in the Pittsburgh area, in a district that was predominated by a town called McKeesport, which is just off the turnpike over towards Pittsburgh. He wanted to find two young, sharp congressmen, one Democrat, one Republican, to come to his town and to debate the merits of the Taft-Hartley law before an organization called the Junto Club. Now, this is sort of a group of people that gathered for discussions on a monthly, semi-monthly basis, dating back to the days of Ben Franklin. Obviously a uniquely Pennsylvanian, I think, kind of thing. And so they picked these two guys, these two bookends on the Labor Committee, young John F. Kennedy, young Richard Milhous Nixon, and they both were scheduled to journey in April of 1947 to the little town of McKeesport, Pennsylvania, which was a boom town then. It was known for its work in the steel industry, particularly steel tubing, which was so vital for construction. It was nicknamed, in fact, Tube City. So you had the steel mills and the places creating these tubes working around the clock, morning, afternoon, midnight shifts, all around the clock. And so both Kennedy and Nixon come. The venue for this debate was a place called the Penn McKee Hotel. Now, at that time, It was one of the most well-known hotels in that particular region, certainly in that town. It was to, McKeesport what the book Cadillac would have been in Detroit, or, to a lesser extent, the Plaza in New York. It was the big hotel. I mean, the saying was, if it happens anywhere in McKeesport, it happens at the Penn McKee. And so this was they had a ballroom set up. They were expecting probably 150 to 200 people to show up for this particular event. More than usual, by the way, because they were bringing in 2 young congressmen, and that was, of course, a big deal. So Kennedy makes his way, and I write about this in a fictional sense, but it's all based on fact. In Jack and Dick, when Kennedy met Nixon, my little novella, which has also been developed into a screenplay, and I think would make a great HBO thing or a great stage play, if anybody out there knows anybody that can help me with that. But they show up at this place. Of course, they knew each other. They'd been acquainted with each other. They'd run into each other over time in the halls of Congress. Their offices weren't terribly far from each other. And they proceeded that night to show up and debate. This is all a matter of history. It happened. There's not much record of it. It's mentioned in biographies of the 2 men. But it's just a footnote. The largest representation, before I attempted to dramatize it, and before I wrote about it in my most recent book, JFK's Ghost, Kennedy, Sorensen, and the Making of Profiles in Courage, the largest write-up was in Chris Matthews' book, Kennedy and Nixon, The Rivalry That Shaped a Generation, which is an excellent book. And he wrote a chapter called Strangers on a Train, and I'll get to what that means here in a moment. So they have this debate, and they go on for a traditional debate. Now, you go into this, you think of Kennedy and Nixon in the debate, and Kennedy and Nixon debate, people automatically flash on September of 1960, that first debate where Nixon famously asked Bobby Kennedy if he should put some makeup on to cover his dark shadow, and Bobby Kennedy said, "No, I wouldn't change a thing, it's perfect," and played him that way. Of course, Kennedy had tanned on the roof of his hotel before that debate. And they get up, and famously, people use the word famously a lot. I guess I'm famous for it. But interestingly, in the aftermath of that debate, the legend is, and it's true, that people who listened to the debate on radio thought Nixon had won the 1960 debate, the first one. And people who watched on television overwhelmingly thought Kennedy had won, and that's because of the visual. It was a moment that changed everything as far as politics and television. But Nixon and Kennedy, that was not their first debate. And going into the one in 1947, you got to understand, Kennedy was a man who was not known as a speaker. He didn't become the great orator, but he eventually was, until he had to grow into that. And he grew into that largely with the help of a great speechwriter by the name of Theodore Sorensen, who helped him on so many writing projects, as I note in my book, JFK's Ghost. But then he became the "ask not what your country can do for you," and all of the tremendous phrases that he's so famous for. But back then, he was not a confident man at the podium. Nixon, on the other hand, had been skilled as a debater in college and in high school, and even in law school. So it was his forte. And he approached that debate like a debater would, point after point. And even though the audience in this Pennsylvania town was certainly a much more pro-labor audience, this is a steel town. So they didn't want the Taft-Hartley law to become the law of the land. They wanted more power to the Union, certainly in this pivotal year, 1947, 1946, as the nation and the world were recovering from the war. And so Nixon was really before an audience that was not a friendly audience. And yet, because of his debating skills, as they went back and forth by all newspaper accounts, Nixon bested Kennedy. And it's interesting, I'm fast forwarding, but back in 1962, when just before the missiles were noticed in Cuba, and there was a midterm election campaign going on, Kennedy made his first visit back to McKeesport, Pennsylvania, this time as president. He had not been back since 1947 in that debate. And he was making a speech there, and he says, the first time I came to McKeesport, and I'm paraphrasing, Mr. Nixon and I debated the Taft-Hartley law. He won that one, Kennedy acknowledged, and then we both went on to other things. Of course, they did. So it was an interesting remembrance, but even by Kennedy's estimation, Nixon beat him that night, bested him. And but Nixon was not treated in a friendly way by the crowd and the press, because it was a pro-labor kind of crowd, and the people's sentiment was certainly not with his particular point of view. And what's fascinating about this story is not just the debate. That's their first debate. Nixon won that one. It's interesting to speculate how much of that and how he had handled Jack Kennedy in 1947 went into how he approached the 1960 debate, which he approached as a debater, but failed to understand the power of image. And it's very interesting to speculate on that. So that day, they both had, their offices had purchased for them overnight tickets back to Washington, D.C. So they had some time before their train would leave. And it just turns out that they were set to share a berth, a Pullman car, in other words, a sleeper car, on the way back to D.C. So the first thing they did is they went with some locals to a local diner, not far, not just adjacent to the train station. They had a hamburger and they talked. I try to recreate what they might have talked about in my novella. And then after that, they go, and this is all in their biographies. Both Nixon biographers and Kennedy biographers have acknowledged this. And again, the great chapter in Chris Matthews' book, Kennedy and Nixon, the chapter marked "Strangers on a Train." If you ever get a hold of that book, read that chapter. They both get this berth, and then they flip a coin to see who gets the upper berth, which is, I guess, the preferred one. And Nixon won that one too. He won the coin toss. And but by all accounts, in all the biographies, they did not sleep that night. These two men, who would one day run against each other as leader of their parties for the presidency of the United States. At this time, they were just low men on the totem pole in the Labor Committee. Very not well-known congressmen. Kennedy had the more famous name because of his father. These two men stayed up all night talking about who knows what, to be a fly on the wall, which is what I try to recreate using basically their own words and ideas that they expressed at other times. So they're consistent with how they would have said something. And I put those words in their mouths at that night, that overnight trip back to DC as the train, the Capital Limited, which was the train that ran between Chicago and Washington, DC, and up to New York. And it was a legendary train. The first class accommodations, dining and all of that. I talk about that train. And as they wound through the various towns of Western Pennsylvania, and then crossing over into Eastern Pennsylvania and down through Maryland and so forth en route to Union Station in Washington, D.C., they have a conversation. What do they talk about? We can only surmise. What were the events of those days? Well, the Cold War was a term that had just been coined. It was getting started in 1946. All of the euphoria at the end of World War II, a lot of that was gone. And by the time Churchill went to Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and gave what is now known as the Iron Curtain speech, issuing a warning to Truman and to the rest of the world that Soviets still wanted domination, which was very clear. And then as 1946 went on, 1947, certainly it was clear that the Soviets, they planned to keep hold. The irony of World War II is that it started over Poland, and yet when it ended, Poland was certainly every bit as much enslaved. And so that was an issue, the Cold War. And of course, at that time, Europe was totally devastated, certainly areas of Western Europe. And so we had the development of, and Truman did this and named it after his Secretary of State, the Marshall Plan, which was designed to provide tremendous benefits to the people over there. And they were sending people on fact-finding missions in advance of this. And Nixon was eventually chosen to go on this fact-finding mission. I have that. Maybe they discussed that. Maybe they discussed politics. Kennedy had been, they were both more fascinated, I think, even at that point, and certainly in their presidencies, you would see this much more by international affairs than domestic affairs. Neither man when you go back and study what they were doing as presidents, I mean, the domestic side was there. Nixon had said at one point that domestic things take care of themselves, the real sphere is international. But that was clear even early on. They were interested in the world and international affairs. Certainly you see that with Nixon and his policies of détente. You see that certainly in Kennedy and the various crises that he had to deal with during his abbreviated presidency. And so they likely talked about the world situation. Kennedy had actually been a journalist working for the Hearst Syndicate. You know, he wanted to be a writer before his brother died and made him the next person in line to be a politician. And he was a very effective writer. And he wrote for the Hearst Syndicate, and he covered the opening of the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco. And the articles are out there. I talk about that some in JFK's Ghost. And so maybe they discussed that. One of the characters at the United Nations in 1945, one of the head people for the American delegation was a man by the name of Alger Hiss. And of course, Alger Hiss famously, there it is again, had this encounter with Richard Nixon before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, in 1946, 47, 48, 47, 48. And Nixon, that's how he became a household name, or at least made his first name in national politics. So possibly they talked about Alger Hiss, possibly talked about the things that were going on in Europe, possibly talked about domestic politics. I mean, Kennedy was impressed with Nixon because Nixon had beat Jerry Voorhees, and he at one point said that would be like beating a McCormick. John McCormick was the big political guy in Massachusetts, Speaker of the House at one point. And that'd be like beating a McCormick in Massachusetts or a Lodge. And so Nixon was a bit of a star. He was actually the star when it came to political stuff of the class of 1946 that came into Congress, not Kennedy. Kennedy was not at all. Nixon was the guy that people said, watch this guy, he's going places. And Kennedy acknowledged that. Now, I've also talked in writing about some of the things that happened later after this. Of course, Nixon went on to run for the Senate in 1950 against Helen Gahagan Douglas, California, the actress and wife of Melvin Douglas. And it was a brutal campaign, one that earned Nixon the term Tricky Dick, the nickname Tricky Dick. And Nixon won, and he went to the United Senate in 1950. Kennedy wanted to move up to the Senate. I mean, his two best friends in Congress had, actually three, because he was good friends with Lyndon Johnson. He was good friends with George Smathers out of Florida, and of course Nixon. So in 1952, against all odds, Kennedy decided to run for the Senate in what would be a Republican year, the Eisenhower sweep, and running against one of the Boston Brahmins, a man named Henry Cabot Lodge. No one thought he could beat Lodge, but Kennedy did. And he was elected to the Senate in 1952. Now, that same year, of course, while Kennedy is being elected to the Senate, Nixon has been chosen at the age of 39 to be the vice presidential candidate, along with on the ticket with General Eisenhower, the hero of Normandy. And Ike and Dick, they run that campaign. 1952 has the moment when Nixon is almost washed out of politics because of the idea of having a secret fund by rich men. He gives a speech now known as the Checkers speech on television that is tremendously popular. And by the way, I think also that Nixon's effectiveness using television in 1952 gave him a false sense of confidence in 1960 when he debated on television and against Kennedy. Just a little side note about why he did so poorly. But you have that Nixon becomes the vice president, Kennedy's in the Senate. There's a letter out there Kennedy wrote to his friend Richard. Dear Dick, he says, something to the effect, I knew you were going places, but I never knew it would happen so soon. Congratulations. Kennedy himself, for a moment or two, aspired to become vice president of the United States in 1956 when Adlai Stevenson threw open. This is his second time to run Stevenson. He got beat by Eisenhower in 52. Now he's nominated again in 56 by the Democrats. And he throws open to the convention the idea of the vice presidency. Estes Kefauver from Tennessee is the front runner, but people persuade John F. Kennedy to run against him, and he almost beats him, comes just a few votes short, but then he makes this dramatic concession on TV, and he really becomes a household name even more so, and he's setting himself up to run for president in 1960. So by the time you move past 1956, these two are they're very good friends. In fact, back in 1950, when Nixon was running against Helen Gahagan Douglas, one day, John F. Kennedy, comes to Nixon's office. By the way, here's a little footnote that I found in researching my book, JFK's Ghost. Evelyn Lincoln, who is Kennedy's secretary, and Rosemary Woods, who was Nixon's longtime secretary from Watergate fame, the so-called 18.5-minute gap, not so-called, but her explanation for that. Their offices, the vice president's office and Kennedy's Senate office, were not far from each other. And these two ladies became friends, and they would often have lunch together. I thought that was a curious little footnote in history. Wonder what they had in conversation. But when Nixon was running for that, Joe Kennedy, the ambassador, didn't want Douglas in the Senate. She was too liberal. Kennedy was a conservative man, and he sent his son Jack, who was then still a congressman, to Nixon's office with an envelope filled with cash, $1,000, whatever it was, and says, "My dad wants to beat that lady out in California." He made a donation. Kennedy made a donation to Nixon's political campaign running for the Senate in 1950. Shows a little bit of the relationship. In 1953, after a short but whirlwind romance and courtship, Kennedy marries Jacqueline Bouvier. And it's the wedding of the decade, big wedding actually it's in Rhode Island. And among the people who are invited to the wedding are Richard and Pat, his wife Nixon. They were considered good friends. And that friendship continued. There are some glimmers back when, in 56, 57, when Kennedy was dealing with his back issues. He almost died after one surgery. They actually performed the last rites on him at one point, Catholic Church. He almost died. A lot of this was due to his adrenal deficiency, Addison's disease, which had not been disclosed, but he had been receiving treatment for. And Nixon visited him at one point in the hospital, and of course shared correspondences. And when Jack Kennedy finally got well enough to come back to the Senate, Nixon, in his ceremonial role as president of the Senate, the vice president of the United States, gave a speech welcoming his good friend back to the Senate. So there was a cordiality, a civility between them that was undeniable. And then you fast forward in the build up to 1960. It's very clear by the time you get to 1958 that the two front runners for the nomination of the respective parties for president are John F. Kennedy for the Democrats and Richard Nixon for the Republicans. And there were some things that could have stopped that. Rockefeller on the Republican side, Humphrey or Johnson even on the Democratic side, but it didn't work out that way. Kennedy by this time had written Profiles in Courage. And one of the things, I'll give an anecdote. I start the book, JFK's Ghost, with a story from December the 7th, 1957, when Mike Wallace, used to be with Sissy, late Mike Wallace, had his own show called The Mike Wallace Show on Saturday nights. And he has as his guest the famous journalist of the time, Drew Pearson. And they talk about a wide range of things. Eisenhower had another stroke at that time. He had been out of the public eye for a long time. There were rumors going around. In fact, Drew Pearson said this on that show: within a year, Richard Nixon will be the president of the United States. Eisenhower will resign because of health. Now, that should have been the thing remembered from that television show on December the 7th, 1957. That would be the tweetable moment now. But it wasn't, because it's something else he said. He said that he talked about the two men that are going to run for president in 2 years in 1960. He talked about Richard Nixon, whom he had a lot of flattering things to say, which is so interesting because he didn't have a lot usually good to say about Nixon. And he talked about Kennedy, and all he said about Kennedy is that he's had the greatest buildup you can have for a guy who had a book published and won a Pulitzer for a book he didn't even write. That created a firestorm about Profiles in Courage. I deal with it in my book. But the point being that that Drew Pearson had tried to out him that way on national television. It was quite a moment. It got Joe Kennedy so mad, they got the lawyers involved, Clark Clifford, a lot of the names that are famous became involved in that. Well, fast forward in 1960, we know the story. It was a fiercely fought campaign. Up to that time, it came down to the end and was the closest electoral campaign as far as popular vote of any time in this century. About 100,000 votes separated the two men. It wasn't called till early the next day. Less than, I think, 1 or 2 votes per precinct would have changed the outcome. There were rumblings of election fraud in places like Cook County, Chicago, Illinois. Nixon was advised by many people to contest the election, but he opted not to do that. To his credit, interesting, it's a different time for people. And so they had a fierce campaign. And of course, during the campaign, they said a lot of hard things about each other, biting things. When you see the video of the debates, for instance, there's some video B-roll from the first debate where Nixon comes into the room, Kennedy's in the room, and they have small talk. You can pick up a little bit of it. You get a sense that they were friendly and they were comfortable around each other. Well, after that campaign was over, and largely at the behest of 2 men, Joseph Kennedy, Kennedy's dad, the president-elect's dad, and then Herbert Hoover, the former president of the United States, who reached out to Nixon. Nixon, after the election in '60, he got beat, and he was down licking his wounds in one of his favorite spots, Key Biscayne, Florida. And they received word that Jack Kennedy, who was down at his father's place in Palm Beach, Florida, wanted to come down and visit with him. This is just within days of the election. And so Nixon said he could come up there, but Kennedy said no, he had a helicopter. Duh. And so he flew down to the Key Biscayne area, and they met at a local hotel restaurant, and they talked. And of course, it was there that Kennedy was really concerned whether Nixon was going to contest the election. He opted not to, and Kennedy was relieved of that. But they had another friendly moment at that particular time. Then when the Bay of Pigs was going on, several months later in April of '61, one of the things that Kennedy did, he reached out to people for advice. He reached out to Richard Nixon. Nixon came to the Oval Office and talked to him. They discussed, among other things, the state of the world. They discussed writing, by the way, and Kennedy urged Nixon to write a book, which he went on and did, a book called 6 Crises. So there's another meeting there. Then, of course, Kennedy's comment in '62 that they had both been to McKeesport. And then, of course, what happens November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is shot. Nixon had been in Dallas that very day. In fact, he left Love Field that morning, just hours before Kennedy's plane would land. And he noted there was a lot of vitriol against Kennedy in the press and other places. And he gave a little talk at the airport, Love Field, Nixon did, to give the president a warm reception and treat him with respect. Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, had been spat upon and had stuff thrown at him just a few weeks earlier. Dallas was a tough town at that time. Well, Nixon, of course, was on a plane on his way back to Kennedy Airport, or what was known then Idlewild Airport, not Kennedy yet. And he got off the plane, got into a cab, and while they were just getting off the Queensboro Bridge on his way to his Manhattan apartment, where he was working then as a lawyer for a large Wall Street firm, he noticed some commotion over to one side, and somebody came up to the cab. "You got your radio on?" The cabbie said, "No, turn it down. The president's been shot." And by the time they get back to Nixon's Fifth Avenue apartment building, he gets out. Apartment building, by the way, that also Nelson Rockefeller lives in. And the doorman announces that the president has died. Nixon goes up and he spends the rest of the day, like most Americans did, watching television. He works the phones, gets a call from J. Edgar Hoover, talks to Hoover, and so forth. And then that night, before he went to bed, he went to his office, his den, there in his apartment, and he pulled out a piece of paper and he wrote a kind letter to Jackie Kennedy. And he cited in the letter his friendship with her husband. And then later, a few weeks later, she wrote a kind note back to him. And it was part of that. Then, of course, life goes on. And Nixon goes through his wilderness period. He's beaten '62 badly. And he goes into his wilderness period. He comes out of it. gets the nomination, 68, wins, beats Hubert Humphrey, becomes the president himself. In 1971, they're getting ready to put the official portrait of John F. Kennedy, a new portrait of Kennedy in the White House. And Mrs. Nixon, Pat, reaches out to Jackie Kennedy and invites her to the White House. They go around some dates, and at some point, but Mrs. Kennedy insists that she's never been back, you see, since her husband died. And she insists that if it's done, it's done without any fanfare, without any hoopla, certainly no press. And I write about that. Let me just read a little bit that I have here. Let's see, let me find that. All right. Hang on. Well, I thought I had it handy. I don't. Basically, she comes back to the White House, and he treats her with tremendous respect, basically, he lets the kids go down. John F. Kennedy Jr. and basically Caroline go down to the Oval Office. There's some famous pictures from Kennedy's days where John, as he was called, was coming out of a private little note, little area there, anyway, so Mrs. Kennedy is just overwhelmed by it, and she writes a great note, and that's sort of how the story closes. I thought I could find that piece, and I can't. But anyways, there's a story of John F. Kennedy crawling up on Nixon's lap and then spilling some milk in his lap. Just sort of a human interest story. That story I write about, it also came out in the press itself with some letters that were revealed earlier in this year, in 2021. You can look at that story online. So that's sort of the frenemy story of Nixon and Kennedy. Hope I haven't bored you to tears, but Dick, where do we go from here? I think you said we can take some questions, and I'd be happy to, if I haven't put anybody to sleep out there already.
Yes, we're going to have you take questions, and my understanding is that there's at least one in the queue for you.
Okay, good. Are they going to be typewritten or?
Typewritten.
Sure, gotcha. Okay, good. One of the panelists, can you describe Nixon's relationship with Kennedy's brothers, Ted and Robert? There's not as much material about that. Of course, Bobby was Kennedy's campaign manager both in 1952 and for the Senate, and in 1960. He was fierce. The Bobby Kennedy that comes along in 1968 is much more a kinder and gentler, guy. But Bobby Kennedy was a fierce person working for his brother. Also, Bobby was early on more conservative than his brother in some ways. He worked for Joseph McCarthy for a while on McCarthy's committee in the Senate. And McCarthy was a friend of Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy thought highly of him. And John F. Kennedy is one of the few people, certainly the only Democrat who abstained. It was health reasons, but he still could have made it work as a vote. But Bobby Kennedy was involved that way. There's not a lot about Bobby Kennedy. I mean, Richard Nixon dreaded the idea in 1968 of running against another Kennedy. That's the person he did not want to run against. And he wanted to run against Lyndon Johnson in 1968, but when Kennedy got involved in the election after Eugene McCarthy almost upset Johnson in New Hampshire in 1968, Kennedy got into the campaign, but Nixon still thought Johnson would win. And then came, of course, March 31st, 1968, when Johnson says, I will not seek another nomination for my party, and pulled out of the race. Then Hubert Humphrey got in. He had the party machinery. Kennedy, who won the California primary, before he was fatally shot, was not a shoe-in for that nomination, but there was math that said he could have made it. And that would have been an interesting repeat of a Kennedy-Nixon affair. Kennedy and his wife attended Bobby Kennedy's funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York in 1968. Ted Kennedy, another thing. Ted Kennedy obviously became the heir apparent in the way the Kennedys sort of did things, but on the same weekend, of course, that the moon landing happened and Neil Armstrong took that one giant leap, that was the weekend of Chappaquiddick, which certainly put poured a lot of water on any parade there for Ted Kennedy. There's a scene, several weeks later, where Ted Kennedy is part of a delegation that comes to the White House for something with Nixon, and Nixon asks him to stay after, and they talk a little bit, and Nixon gives him a pep talk about knowing what it is to come back from defeat and come back from hard things, and he encouraged him. That's the extent. I mean, I think that because of the friendship and beginning early on, because of the camaraderie as both being Navy men, I think Nixon and Kennedy had much more chemistry that was possible than between Bobby and Ted, who were by their own definition fiercely more partisan and certainly not as warm toward Nixon. All right, so when you talk about the relationship between Jackie and Pat, they didn't have much of a relationship, but it was Pat who reached out to Jackie during the when the portrait was going to be put up in 1971. It was her that opened that particular door to come. So I think, and she wrote a nice warm note to Pat, but they did not. Pat had much more of a relationship with Lady Bird Johnson than she did with Jackie Kennedy. There was a tremendous age difference. You got to remember, Jackie Kennedy was only 31 years old when her husband died. That's a tremendous, and so there was probably 16, 17, 18 years difference between her and Pat Nixon. Thank you for an enlightening talk. Can you describe what it meant to be a conservative Democrat and a liberal Republican in 1946? Perhaps some examples of policies that fall under these definitions. That's interesting. I think it's hard to put your hand on it. The terms liberal and conservative have changed meanings over time. And at one time, classic liberalism meant individual liberty and freedom and so forth. It certainly seems to imply something different than that now, as far as more of a larger government. There's a big government, larger government thing. And of course, absent then were polarizing issues like some of the culture war issues, abortion, other issues that are involved in the culture war. So a conservative Democrat would have been, someone who basically, championed the working class and so forth. A liberal Republican, I think, was someone who saw the need for more government intervention than was typical with the Republican Party. Republican Party had been somewhat isolationist, had been somewhat anti-government. So a liberal Republican is what we would call today a moderate Republican. I would suggest that in 1946, Nixon could have been described as a rhino, and Kennedy could have been described as a dino, I guess, a Democratic name only. Far from putting me to sleep, your conversation was so enlightening. Oh, that's nice. Illuminating. I'm still reading a good bit about JFK's father, that old pirate. Joe, your firm that. Yeah, he was an interesting guy. There's a new book, I haven't read it yet, called The Ambassador, which deals with his years in Europe. I'm looking forward to getting into that myself. Thank you. I am of an age to remember these men, and I learned a lot. Good. Confirmed a good bit of what I'm learning about the time from that family and history. Thanks also for recommending Chris Matthews' book. You're welcome. And Kennedy has a reputation as a warmer, more humorous person, whereas Nixon is more serious and dour. Is that fair? And how would that have entered into their friendship? That's a very, very interesting case, because Kennedy had a reputation for being warmer, but both men, I think, struggled with really close relationship with people. Nixon came across as more awkward in social settings, small talk, was very difficult with him. Kennedy mastered that. Kennedy was a bit of a charmer in that way, but Nixon could do that. And Nixon did have a sense of humor. I personally think that as a person goes through life, and certainly Nixon, there are people who can take crises and negativity better than others. There are people who can handle it when people criticize them better than others. Nixon was somebody who just never quite learned how to deal with it, took a lot of things personally. And I think over time it did sour his personality. Let's see. Thank you. Learned a great deal. Did Nixon have any relationship with Senator Biden? Not to my knowledge at all. I mean, I think Biden was first elected in 74. I could be wrong. And Nixon was by that time certainly getting ready to go for the presidency. Biden may have been elected in that sort of anti-Watergate thing that happened in 74. I don't have that fact at my hand. But Nixon had relationship with politicians. He cultivated those relationships in the 70s, even after he left office, even with Carter, certainly with Reagan, George H.W. Bush, who had worked for Nixon. But to my knowledge, not any with Biden. I do think, totally political comment here, but Biden could learn a little bit from Richard Nixon, not on the character side, but on the learning how to navigate the center a little bit better. Anything else out there? Good questions. I mean, Dick had told me that you're going to be tough on me. I hate to say that, but these have been nice, warm, fuzzy questions. I appreciate that. Hopefully, I answered a lot of these questions.
David, I really want to thank you for a great presentation. I think we all learned a lot. We're so happy to have had you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.